sometimes our politicians lend themselves to more extremist ideology and thought. And the way they do this is they weave it into their speeches without us really knowing. But the impact of doing so actually shapes public policy because their voices are so prominent that we start looking at issues through that extremist ideology or lens. And, the best examples, of course, are Donald Trump and a lot of the rhetoric that he shared during his term as president. But don't think that it's just Donald Trump alone. There are many examples on the left that I'll share with you as well. And this isn't meant to call out a singular politician. Instead, this is meant to show how when extremist thought or ideology weaves itself into our discourse, the lasting impact is it shapes how we understand big issues. And we find ourselves less likely to dabble in nuance and more likely to be okay with political polarization and that letting that shape not only our ideas, but our relationships with others as well. So Joe Biden was recently at Morehouse College, and he gave a speech to the graduates that definitely sounded like a campaign re-election speech. It is, after all, 2024. There is an election happening. But here's what he said specifically about violence committed towards blacks.
Well, that's my commitment to you, to show you democracy, democracy, democracy is still the way. If black men are being killed in the street, we bear witness. For me, that means to call out the poison of white supremacy, to root out systemic racism.
So right there, Joe Biden is saying that, he needs to root out white supremacy, inferring that black violence is a cause. White supremacy is committing acts of violence towards blacks. Now, we know that that does happen in the United States, but the reality is the majority of homicide that is committed towards blacks are intraracial. So this is not my perspective. This was a study done by Harvard University called New Perspectives in Policing, a comprehensive study looking at homicide rates from 1980 to 2008. So what this comprehensive study found was the vast majority of homicides are intraracial. 84% of white victims were killed by whites. 93% of black victims were killed by blacks. And specifically, black males between the ages of 18 to 24 were dramatically overrepresented in homicide. And also, in the report, it talks about the underreporting of homicide rates of black men, distrust of the police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So intraracial homicide is really important. And why this is important is particularly for black men. There are 5 or 6 leading causes of death. Homicide is in the top 4 or 5, depending on what study you look at. And so, I understand why the president is not talking about the nuance of intraracial violence. But to say that white supremacy is the reason why blacks are being killed in the streets is extremist ideology, as I understand it. It paints such a simplistic picture of a complex issue, which is actually factually incorrect. It is not correct that interracial violence is a leading cause of death for black men in particular. It's nowhere near that. It happens, it's rare, but it is nowhere near that. And listen, it's not just Joe Biden. It's all politicians, but it's an example of how that simple slogan is woven into a speech without us even realizing it, and that shaping how we understand homicide rates, as well as quote unquote threats to the black population. Intraracial homicide is in fact the reality in the United States. It's probably the reality in many other places as well. yes, there is interracial violence, but it is much less. And that's an example, again, whittling things down, extremist ideology. But the other thing that we also have to remember to this is that nowhere in this study and many others does it discuss white supremacy as a leading cause of death for blacks. And so it is extremist what Biden is saying because it's factually incorrect. And it's also sowing the seeds of divisiveness in societies. Um, this is not going to, lend itself to bringing people together, which is what moderates want in their leaders. They want leaders to bring people together. They don't want them to be succumbed by extremist ideology. So again, when moderates are starting to weave this language in, it gets pretty scary. Now, there's a couple other examples, and I'm just going to fast forward through Biden's speech to show you a couple others for your awareness. So I'm going to just share this and let me know what you think as well.
Not in my house.
Oh, let me back it up.
And then the constant attacks on black election workers who count your vote. Insurrectionists who storm the Capitol with Confederate flags are called patriots by some. Not in my house. Black police officers, black veterans protecting the Capitol were called another word, as you recall.
Now, again, Biden is talking about the January 6th riots there. And listen, there's a lot of topics and a lot of discussion on January 6th. But the reality is, and again, there needs to be a robust conversation in the United States about electoral reform. There needs to be some discussion about that on some level. Now, I do not agree with January 6th and storming the Capitol, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that what January 6th should have shown all Americans is that there is real dissent amongst there's a lack of faith in the voter election system in the United States, and that needs to be discussed further. But to call people who, again, yes, there were people who wanted to overthrow the Capitol on January 6th, of course. But I'm sure there are many Americans, if you were to ask them, that would say, yeah, I don't know what really happened, but I'm not too confident in the electoral system. I bet you there are many Americans who feel that way. And I would say that many Americans feel that way, but they're probably less likely to come out and say that they feel that way. But for the president to say, oh, they're just insurrectionists, again, it panders to a political base. But more importantly, it paints it through that prism. We can't even sit down and discuss January 6th without someone considering them insurrectionists, Confederate flag wearers, etc. That inflammatory language continues. And again, it sows the seed for division. Again, I'll keep playing it. There's one more piece I want to share with you.
They also say out loud, these other groups, immigrants poison the blood of our country. Like the Grand Wizard and fascists said in the past. But you know and I know, we all bleed the same color. In America, we're all created equal. Extremists close the doors of opportunity, strike down affirmative action, attack the values of diversity, equality, and inclusion.
Now, you could hear the scattered applause, but Biden touched on a few things there again, very extremist ideology again. When it comes to illegal immigration in the United States, there's 50,000, I believe, illegal immigrants crossing. I don't want to say daily. I don't want to say weekly. I think it's monthly. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of illegal immigrants crossing into the United States on a regular basis. And it's natural for people to feel some type of ways about that. Of course, it's going to change things, and this has been going on for years, decades. And so it's going to change communities. It's going to change societies. It's going to change the general makeup of entire areas, entire, suburban communities, urban communities, etc. As a result. And of course, there's going to be resentment from citizens. Of course, I think that goes without saying. They're not extremists for wanting the government to enact more regulations on immigration. That's not an extremist idea. But again, painting it through the prism of that makes one believe that those who are questioning these policies are somehow extremists. And the same is true again when it comes to other topics that Biden mentions in his speech at Morehouse. Now, again, it's 2024, it's a campaign, and I understand Biden's got to count the votes and move on, count the votes and move on. And I know that. I understand it. He's a politician at the end of the day. But my point is that when you allow extremist ideology into your rhetoric, it's more than just counting the votes and moving on. The danger that moderates have, I think, by allowing this into their lexicon is they're shaping public policy through that prism, through that lens. And so what's going to happen? Researchers are going to research it through that lens. News commentators are going to comment on it through that lens. Podcasters, the entire general public will start looking at this through white supremacy, on blacks. And the moderates who are looking at this from the data to say, listen, there's more intra-racial violence and that needs to be discussed, they're going to be taken out of the equation. They're not allowed to discuss. So our discourse becomes more polarized, and the space for nuance, sober second thought, and reflection is gone. And that truly is the danger of our discourse today. So what we can do is let our politicians know that we disagree with the framing that they're using, whether it's by writing to them, but also by calling it out. And of course, this is very much the same for Donald Trump as it is for Joe Biden. But regardless, no matter where you stand on this issue, I think it's very important that we recognize this is happening in our discourse and we call it out for what it is. But let me know what you think. Do you agree with this assessment? Do you think that I'm kind of overstating it or understating it? Let me know what you think in the comment section below.